Yeah, thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. Can people hear me okay? Is this?
Sure. Yep. Your voice is pretty strong.
That's what I was hoping. Yeah, is this okay? Is this okay? I just wanted to start off. Has anybody seen Hamilton, the musical? Good. It's on Disney Plus now. You can see it on there. But I wanted to start off because that kind of like perfectly parallels the story here. It's the life of Alexander Hamilton closely overlaps Udney Hayes, and there's a lot of events there that kind of come up in here. Highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun, but also if you're at all interested in this story, there's a lot of parallels there as well. So kind of just to just get started off on kind of how I came to this topic. I've lived in Underhill my whole life, and anybody who's been here knows it's like a small, quiet town. And I'm kind of just generally interested in history. I was wondering, well, if you go all the way back in Underhill, kind of like, what was it like early on? Kind of, today it's like a small, quiet town, but, like earlier on, what were things like? What was going on, like, way back? And I kind of had, I was actually reading Gordon Wood's Empire of Liberty at the time, which is about, like the early Republic period, kind of, right after the Revolution, up into the early 1800s. And I was kind of wondering about that time period. So there's like all the prominent figures at the time, and I was wondering, basically, did people in Underhill have access to news, to like know what was going on at that time? Did they, like, were they aware of what was happening like in politics or like the prominent figures at the time? Did they know kind of generally what was going on, either in the country or abroad, right? So the French Revolution was also kind of like a big thing happening during this time period. And I was wondering, like, did people in Underhill like know about that stuff happening abroad? Were they aware of kind of like what was going on around the world? And then lastly, I was wondering, did people in Underhill wear fancy pants? You know the kind that I'm talking about, like breeches, like, like what did they look like? What did people look like? What clothes did they wear? Kind of like what was kind of, just to get a sense of like what things were like at that time in the town, kind of a general sense of the people and the times. And so that investigation generally brought me to Udney Hay, which answers a lot of these questions. So there's very little information about his early life. There's indications that he was born in Scotland. That's referenced later in his life, but where is kind of vague. There's a note in kind of some old historical society notes that it was Bellevue in Scotland, which is this small town up in the northeast, very tiny town. So it sounds like somebody kind of traced back and found some, like the parish records there. And they believe that that was where he was from, the son of James Hay. The mother was not recorded in those parish records. From there's like really no information until like the 1770s, where he turns up in Quebec, and it's noted that he was a lumber trader in Quebec with his brother Charles. So in December of 1775, Udney Hay and Charles Hay, Scottish brothers living in Canada, left Quebec City on the approach of General Richard Montgomery. Charles Hay returned in 1776, but his brother Udney first joined Moses Hazen's 2nd Canadian Regiment in the American Army. So that's from the Founders' archives. But just that's like really like the earliest information that we have is that he had joined this regiment during the Revolution early on. This is the earliest record that I've found for Udney Hay, earliest primary source referencing him. So this is from John Stark's Orderly Book of 1776. This is in the New Hampshire Historical Society. And it mentions Captain Udney Hay of Colonel Hazen's regiment is, at the request of Colonel Campbell, is appointed Assistant Deputy Quartermaster General and is to be considered as such. So this is the earliest record that I've been able to find that's referencing him. So that's at Crown Point in 1776, about a year into the Revolution. And I think it's noteworthy that this is pretty high ranking for that early on. Like, he was moving his way up in the ranks pretty quickly. And as Quartermaster General, he was responsible for procuring supplies for the Army, which was a very difficult job. The Army was always short on supplies, and it was his responsibility to take care of that. So just to get a sense of kind of what he was working on. So throughout the war, there's a lot of correspondence that's mentioning Udney Hay. But for the purpose of this presentation, I've just pulled like a few examples here and there that I thought were particularly interesting. But if you are interested, there's a lot more out there to look at, which is very interesting to dig into. So here's just a letter from Philip Schuyler, 7th of July, 1777. So this was written to George Washington from Saratoga, and he's just mentioning, soon after I had dispatched the letter, which I did myself the honor to address to Your Excellency from Stillwater, I met with Lieutenant Colonel Hay, Deputy Quartermaster General, who was at Ticonderoga. He informs me that on Saturday it had been agreed upon to retreat from Ticonderoga in Mount Independence, that between 2 and 3 o'clock on Sunday morning, General St. Clair with the rest of the general officers and the army marched out of the lines at Mount Independence, that Colonel Long with about 600 men embarked on board our few vessels and in bateaux, that just before they arrived at Skenesborough, they were overtaken by the enemy's vessels and gunboats and were obliged to abandon the vessels, in which we lost all our ammunition. Indeed, Colonel Hay assures me that not one earthly thing has been saved. So this is just interesting that early on, already George Washington is being informed of kind of Udney Hay's position and what he's doing. Again, this is 1777, and very prominent officers are referencing Udney Hay and his activities early on in the war. So this is a letter from George Washington to Henry Lawrence, who was the president of the Continental Congress at the time. So this is January 1st. And he mentions here, several of the officers from the northward spoke of the uncommon activity and exertions of Colonel Hay, Deputy Quartermaster General in that department. Hearing him so well spoken of, I inquired very particularly of most of those who had served there uncommon difficulty. who had served there the last campaign, and of General Sullivan and Wayne, who had served in that country the two preceding ones in times of uncommon difficulty. They confirmed the favorable report of the others and went so far as to say that without disparagement to any other gentleman, they thought him the best qualified of any man upon the continent for the office in question, Quartermaster General for the Army. Upon this universal concurrence of all parties, I think I may venture to recommend Colonel Hay to the consideration of Congress, and if upon further inquiry they should find him answer to the high character which he bears, I hope no time may be lost in appointing him, provided some other has not already been the object of their choice. I will just add that Colonel Hay's pretensions in right of seniority entitle him to notice. So George Washington is saying he's a high-ranking officer, and everyone tells me he's the best guy for this job. There is a note from Henry Lawrence to someone else referring to this letter, and they're saying that they don't like George Washington telling them who to hire for the job. The idea was that the Continental Congress was supposed to be in charge of that, and George Washington should kind of stay out of that for this particular appointment. And it mentions that there was someone else that George Washington had recommended that they were a little bit skeptical of. But I think that this, coming from George Washington, he was speaking sincerely in recommending Udney Hay himself. It was kind of just politics involved, and ultimately the job went to Nathaniel Greene as Quartermaster General of the Army. And Udney Hay works closely with him throughout the war. So this is just an interesting note here from George Washington to Colonel Morgan Lewis here. Sir, as the services of Colonel Hay, Deputy Quartermaster, from the present appearance of things will probably be very little wanted in the station in which he is present, and will certainly be of considerable utility in this army. You will order him to join it with all possible dispatch, unless, from any reason which is unknown or does not occur to me, the general service will essentially suffer by it. I am, sir, your most obedient servant. So it's, this is George Washington specifically requesting that Udney Hay be sent to Valley Forge, where he thought he could do more good. There's an interesting note here down below. Colonel Hay had reached Valley Forge by the 28th of April when he wrote Gates to request a reassignment back to the Northern Department. So he did go to Valley Forge, likely met George Washington in person and some of the other officers at that time, but apparently found that maybe he could be used somewhere else and requested to be reassigned back up north in New York, where he had been doing most of his work. So that's in early 1778, while the Army was encamped at Valley Forge. So this is another interesting record, 1778. There's a note here from George Washington to Lieutenant Colonel Udney Hay, 15th of September, 1778. It wasn't actually addressed to Udney Hay, but there's a note that that Nathaniel Greene was actually absent at this time. He was in Rhode Island and Boston, and Udney Hay was, for the time, serving as the Quartermaster General of the entire army. So that just gives a sense of kind of like his station in the army, that he was basically second to Nathaniel Greene in this role, and this order went directly to Udney Hay to carry out. It's noted at the bottom there that it was actually in Alexander Hamilton's writing. So Alexander Hamilton and some others had done the actual writing for many of these orders that were coming from Washington, but it gives you a sense of kind of like who was familiar with Udney Hay at the time. So this I thought was just interesting as well, kind of like a more personal note. So this is from July of 1780, and this is a letter from Alexander Hamilton to his wife, Eliza. And he mentions, I've been wishing, my love, for an opportunity of writing to you, but none has offered. I sit down to write a line ready for a sullen call, which will be enclosed to Colonel Hay. And he's referring to Udney Hay. And there's a note here that Udney Hay was at Fishkill, therefore letters enclosed to him could be forwarded by him to Elizabeth Schuyler at Albany. So just kind of like an interesting note that Alexander Hamilton had actually asked Udney Hay to deliver kind of personal messages for him to his wife, which it's speculated, it's not certain, but it's speculated that this little poem here might be what was enclosed in that particular letter. But I think it just gives a sense of kind of the relationship between some of these people at the time. And it was interesting to me to come across this as kind of just a more personal thing mixed in with some of the war correspondence happening at the time. So this here is a letter to George Washington from Benedict Arnold. And there's a note here. I take the liberty of including extract of a letter from Colonel Hay of the 9th respecting flour, etc. I certainly wish he may succeed in his endeavors to procure flour, of which I am very doubtful, in the quantities he has requested, as I believe the requisition larger than, when all others are answered, the state can comply with. So this is the 12th of September, 1780. And it's just interesting that it's just Benedict Arnold. He's just mentioning that Udney Hay is looking for flour. He's probably not going to find it, but he's searching for it right now. There's kind of an interesting sequence of notes here. This is George Washington's response to Benedict Arnold, and there's just a note in here. I hope Colonel Hay's plans for obtaining a supply of flour from the state of New York and his application to the people of the grants. That's important. His application to the people of the grants, right? So he's referring to Vermont there, the New Hampshire grants at the time. So Vermont had declared itself a republic in 1777, but the note from Washington is referring to it as the grants. That's very important here. In his application to the people of the grants will both be met with success. He is a faithful and indefatigable officer. Now, if you're familiar with Benedict Arnold, a week after this, Benedict Arnold defects to the British. I think that that's just an interesting note there from Washington. Udney Hay is a faithful officer. This is 1 week before. Arnold's already kind of in contact with the British. This is 1 week before he officially leaves. So I think it's interesting to think about that fact, that kind of one of the last, basically one of his last communications is about this flour with Benedict Arnold. Now this over here on the right is the response that Udney Hay gets from Vermont. And there's another kind of interesting kind of tangent here associated with Matthew Lyon. This is coming from Matthew Lyon, who later becomes a prominent politician in the state, and he had actually been garrisoned in Jericho right here during the Revolution in 1776, very briefly. Separate story there, but interesting connection. So there's this response from Matthew Lyon, speaking on behalf of Vermont. He says that they have examined said papers and also conferred with Colonel Hay thereon, and find that he is appointed by the Continental Commissary General to purchase provisions in the New Hampshire grants, and that it is the opinion of your committee that Colonel Hay, by coming to this state and making application to the legislature thereof, has missed his instructions. And that it is further the opinion of your said committee that considering the embarrassment this state lies under with regard to the claims of other states and the jurisdiction assumed over it, considering also the large supply of provisions already granted for the troops to be in the service of this state the year ensuing, should we suppose the state could be called the New Hampshire grants, which is by no means admissible. The legislature of this state ought not to undertake to supply Colonel Hay with the beef required. So Udney Hay is getting some beef here, but it's not what he's asking for, right? So what he's saying is, you're insulting us by referring to us as the grants. We're not going to give you the beef you're requesting. Just an interesting kind of thing that happened there. So this is from 1781. This is an intelligence letter. So this is from Udney Hay writing to George Washington. Sir, Your Excellency, I hope you will forgive my troubling you with the enclosed narrative, which I was induced to take the liberty of transmitting from the opinion of the narrator's honesty and candor, having known him several years in previous to the commencement of the present war. And I'm convinced whatever errors he has committed in the narration may have the effect of ignorance, not design. I imagine, too, though it might contain no new information, it might tend to corroborate or disprove intelligence Your Excellency may have already received. I have the honor to be with every sentiment of respect, and so on and so forth. But so this is just a letter that Udney Hay writes to George Washington saying, hey, I know this guy, he was a prisoner of the British, and here's some intelligence that he has. But it kind of speaks to, at least from Udney Hay's perspective, feeling like he had that relationship with George Washington where he could just write to him and say, this is some stuff I've heard, you can trust me, I trust this guy. I think it's indicative of the relationship that he had established with Washington by that point in time, that he can send a letter like that. The letter itself is pretty interesting. This is just an excerpt from it, but it goes on. And it just details kind of like where troops were stationed for the British in the Champlain Valley. And it goes into a lot of detail of counts and exactly where they were and everything. Pretty interesting document there. This is just for fun. This is a 1781 letter from Udney Hay to John Stark, just to get a sense of his handwriting. So this is kind of what it looked like. This is in the New Hampshire Historical Society, but there you see the note and you see him signed at the bottom, Udney Hay. So late and post-war, Udney Hay becomes a land agent in New York, and he has business associations with the Allen brothers and Melanchthon Smith. So he lived at the Clinton House in Poughkeepsie, New York from 1780 to 1786. This is the Clinton House right here. You can visit it today. It's owned by the Park Service or something like that in New York, and people can visit that. So it's an interesting site there that's been preserved. And when the house burned in 1783, George Washington offered Army engineers to rebuild. Again, another kind of indication of the sort of relationship that they had. Udney Hay actually mentions that later in life, a couple decades later, he mentions that had happened kind of as an indication of the sort of relationship that he had with Washington, that kind of support was offered to him. So yeah, this is just the note that's granting permission for the assistance in rebuilding after that fire. And this is kind of just another example here of Udney Hay writing to George Washington, 1784. Again, this is kind of just a personal note. This is after the war's over. But he's writing to George Washington to say, hey, my brother has been a prisoner of the British. Could you help in getting him out? And basically there's these claims here of why he was held prisoner, that he was suspected of corresponding with the rebels by message or otherwise, that he was formerly connected in trade with a brother who was now in high office with the rebels, which is true, that he was known to be an errant rebel at his heart. In his heart, he was a rebel. So this is, again, 1784, and George Washington does reply back to him. He says, the interruption of the post by the frost will occasion a delay of this answer, which otherwise would have been avoided. Not being able to decipher the name of the merchant in London, to whose care you desired my letter to your brother might be addressed, I send the enclosed certificate for him under cover to you. And he mentions, again, just kind of a personal note, thank you for your kind and friendly wishes, and with Mrs. Washington's compliments to Mrs. Hay and yourself, a return of friendly sentiments. So just that Udney Hay seems to have felt that he had that relationship with George Washington. After the war, writing him personal letters, that's from Mount Vernon, that Washington is sending that. Melanchthon Smith and the Anti-Federalists. So this is, we just mentioned Melanchthon Smith appears to have been business partners with Udney Hay in Poughkeepsie. He was one of the founding member of the New York Manumission Society, 1785, with John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, George Clinton, and others. But during the ratifying convention in the 1780s for the Constitution, he was a very prominent, important figure. So basically, the Constitution was the Constitutional Convention was sort of convened with the understanding that the Articles of Confederation were too weak. At least that's what many, especially officers in the war, had thought, because they saw firsthand kind of the problems of having a weak central government. So especially George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, they wanted a stronger central government, and that was kind of how the Constitution was designed, to strengthen the federal government. The Anti-Federalists were sort of a response to that. Remember, there's the Federalist Papers with James Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton writing under the pseudonym Publius to defend the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists had their own separate Anti-Federalist papers where they wrote why you shouldn't adopt the Constitution or how you should change it. So there were many kind of people in this group. Patrick Henry was sort of the leader. Melanchthon Smith was a very prominent Anti-Federalist and may have been the author of pseudonymous essays under the name Brutus and Federal Farmer. George Clinton is another one. We'll see more of him later, possibly writing under the name Cato. So this was kind of 1788 when people are assessing whether they should adopt the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists are saying we should change it or consider not adopting it. Smith ends up compromising, and he does vote in favor of it. But this is important to understand kind of early on at the time of the Constitution. This is kind of when some of the early factions are forming for the people who want a strong central government and the people who want stronger state governments, a weaker kind of federal government. So just keep that in mind going forward here. 1793, Citizen Genet. This was a very big deal at the time. He's essentially unknown today, but at the time in 1793, this was a very big deal that, remember, this is at the time of the French Revolution. They have a new government. They appoint Edmund Charles Citizen Genet as the minister to the United States. So he arrives in Charleston, South Carolina, April 8th, 1793, as the French minister seeking aid from the United States. Anybody who's seen Hamilton, Are You Ready for a Cabinet Meeting? Washington issues Proclamation of Neutrality, April 22nd, 1793. That's the government's official stance, neutral. They're not going to support either side in the French Revolution, namely between the British and the French. The United States is going to remain neutral, and that's where Citizen Genet comes in. He wasn't taking that as an answer, so he appealed directly to the people. And this really appealed to kind of the anti-federalist sort of class of people who preferred more power to the people, less to the federal government. So many people kind of answered that call and wanted to help him, specifically with outfitting privateering vessels to attack the British fleet. And Udney Hay specifically reached out to him directly. There are letters, which I have not been able to see myself, but I've seen them referenced in books between Citizen Genet and Udney Hay. So the Washington administration is deeply offended that this is going on, that this is basically undermining the federal government to have citizens kind of just deciding that they're going to support kind of just rogue actors in American foreign policy. So Washington and Jefferson, Hamilton essentially agree that this guy needs to go. They reach out to France and say, you have to recall Genet. However, over the summer, the Girondin faction in France, which had sent him, was overthrown by the radical Jacobins. And they were happily requesting that he come back so he could be guillotined. So he knew that that was going to happen, and he appealed to Washington for political asylum to remain in the United States, which was granted. He ends up living in upstate New York and remains quiet. This was the following year. This is kind of an interesting thread of letters here. This is Lord Dorchester's appeal to the Indians of Canada, and basically that's kind of how this incident is known, as Lord Dorchester's reply to the Indians is basically how this episode is referenced. But it's at the time there were growing tensions. Remember, the French Revolution is going on. There's the British versus the French, and the British are kind of there's kind of this tension just in general. Kind of what's the United States going to do? Are they going to join the fight either way? And basically, the British were seeking out alliances with the native tribes. And this is a letter from Udney Hay to George Clinton in New York, the governor of New York. This is 1794, and it's noted that this is Burlington. So Udney Hay is obviously in Vermont at this point in time. It's a little bit unclear where he was in the years between the Clinton house and here. He likely spent much of his time in New York City, however, which is referenced later. But this letter is from Burlington, 1794. From your excellency's uninterrupted and, as I believe, unalterable regard for the happiness and welfare of your country, I take the liberty of enclosing a copy of Lord Dorchester's reply to the Indians. I am now certain that an express passed this place with it about the 20th of last month for Mr. Hammond, and equally so that the citizens of Montreal are in general dissatisfied with it and hesitate not to say that it is without any orders from the king. His lordship's uncommon prudence and caution forbids the belief of such a supposition. Should you have seen it previous to this, my intention can be pled as my only excuse for the present unnecessary trouble given to you. So he's saying, I've heard some stuff, I'm sending you what I know, do with it what you will. So that's, again, to George Clinton. George Clinton writes to George Washington. And this is shortly after he had received the letter, 20th of March, 1794. Sir, I conceive it to be my duty to communicate for your information the copy of a speech made to me this morning by Colonel Lewis Cook, who with 4 other Indians of the villages of St. Regis is now at this place, and also a copy of a speech of Lord Dorchester to the chiefs of the 7 villages or nations of Lower Canada. The latter I this moment received enclosed in a confidential letter from a gentleman in Vermont. I believe the authenticity of it may be relied on. I am with the highest esteem and respect your most obedient servant. So this is George Washington's response. He's thanking George Clinton for the letter, and he's saying, kind of, this is important information, appreciate you passing it on. George Washington appears to have potentially already heard rumors of this, but he's saying the information that you've provided confirms in my mind that this is the case and this is a problem that needs to be addressed. This is to George Washington, again from George Clinton. This is April 7th, and he mentions here specifically that the letter had come from Colonel Udney Hay, who transmitted me the speech. And he's saying, I trust Udney Hay, and that this is true. Side note here, there's just an interesting note here that Colonel Joseph Fay is mentioned down below, who Thomas Jefferson had, if you look through these letters and query these names, Thomas Jefferson had tried to buy maple seeds from him, from Vermont, to start a maple sugaring operation in Virginia. The idea being to make maple syrup in such quantities that they could replace kind of the sugar trade with the Caribbean. All of his maple trees died and nothing came of that, but it was a very interesting kind of thing to see in these letters. And this is kind of just with John Jay going to England. He was to negotiate with the British, given the tensions that were going on, and it's mentioned in here, copies of Lord Dorchester's speech, which would have come from Udney Hay, were included in that. So kind of just to sort of level set at what's going on, at this point in time, the government is kind of starting to sort of divide between factions led by Alexander Hamilton, the Federalists, and Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson is more in favor of that smaller government, more agrarian. Alexander Hamilton is in favor of a stronger central government, more industry. People would say kind of moneyed interests, or kind of that he represents aristocracy, maybe even monarchy. But that was kind of the major division sort of happening at this time, and sort of gradually that became a larger and larger divide, which kind of we'll see growing. The Democratic Republican societies, 1793, 1794, are one of the kind of results of this. So the Democratic Republican societies were obviously kind of in that Jeffersonian Democratic Republican camp. And that represented really kind of the opposition to kind of the Federalists, which viewed themselves as sort of the kind of the official or the kind of the correct, like that's the true government party. And initially the Democratic Republicans were viewed almost as like subversive, kind of like maybe even sort of disloyal. There were just a lot of questions about sort of that faction of politics, and especially these societies that started popping up. Citizen Genet promotes a lot of these. There's a lot of connection with Citizen Genet in these societies. And Udney Hay is a member of the New York Democratic Republican Society, including associates like Melanchthon Smith, George Clinton, James Nicholson, Aaron Burr. And Udney Hay establishes the Associated Democratic Society of the County of Chittenden in Colchester in March 1794. So he's going off and starting his own societies. And I think that this might also kind of speak to some of his intent with moving to Vermont, which at the time, a very young state, just entered the Union in 1791, small population. There was a lot of opportunity here for kind of forming kind of new sentiments or kind of expanding parties. If you go into a place with a smaller population, there's more chance that you can be kind of work your way up through the political system there, and that may have been part of his inspiration. Also, his connection with the Allens likely gave him access to land in the area. So the Democratic Republicans, very pro-French, very anti-British, opposed to the Jay Treaty, right? So the idea of the Jay Treaty was to kind of reconcile with the British, to kind of ease the tensions. And the Democratic Republicans didn't like that. They thought that should be happening with the French, not the British. And again, opposed to a strong federal government. So there's just a note here from the Chittenden Society, Principles of Formation, kind of the constitution of that society, written by Udney Hay. And it kind of just mentions here sort of the, that they're not, it says that, they're influenced by principle only, not by party, or party views, right? Party was a dirty word at this time. Nobody wanted to talk about political parties because that was viewed as like a very subversive thing. So they're saying, we're not a party, we're not associated with any other interests or anything. We're just acting as individuals, looking out for the good of our nation. And many people who kind of were in that Democratic Republican camp viewed themselves as kind of appealing to the true nature of the revolution, kind of like a localist movement away from big government in England and kind of in favor of smaller local government. Important note here, it's referenced, for some part of the approbation referred to, see Chipman's Principles of Government. So Nathaniel Chipman was a prominent lawyer in Vermont at the time, and he had written kind of this, the sketches of the principles of government. He's a very strong Federalist. So he was cited kind of in that Constitution as, we're playing by the rules here. This is how government should function. We're fine here. We're on the same page, saying things very different than what Federalists actually think. So Nathaniel Chipman is so angry, he writes to Alexander Hamilton about this. He says, "Dear Sir, you have undoubtedly noticed the proceedings of the Democratic Society in the county of Chittenden in this state." So Udney Hay, this is another kind of piece on the side, had been publishing kind of the proceedings from the society, again in Colchester here in New York and like other states. So somebody like Alexander Hamilton would have seen this. I find that they have been published with great avidity in New York and Philadelphia. The founder of that society and sole author of their late proceedings, perhaps you are apprised, is not an inhabitant of this state, but resides generally in the city of New York. So again, we see that he was in Burlington earlier this year, but he seems to have been spending a lot of his time in New York City still by this date. What could have induced that gentleman to call in the aid of my name or my writings in support of such proceedings is best known to himself. If you have not read the work from which the quotations are made, you might be led, from the detached sentences there cited, to believe that it contains the principles of anarchy instead of the principles of government. principles wholly subversive of a representative democracy. So that kind of speaks to how Federalists viewed the Democratic Republicans. It's a good summary of kind of Federalist sentiment in general at the time. Hamilton and Nicholson duel, 1794. So news had come back of the Jay Treaty, the result of that. And there was a riot going on in New York City in the summer of 1795 by unhappy Democratic Republicans who were kind of protesting or rioting against the Jay Treaty, right? Having come to an agreement with Britain, they viewed what John Jay had agreed to as a very bad deal, that the British won out in that, and that the French were kind of just being abandoned, which the Democratic Republicans viewed the French as the true allies of the United States, as they had been during the American Revolution, regardless of the fact that their government had swapped during the French Revolution. So this is just great here. These letters about duels, they're very polite. So there's this riot going on. Alexander Hamilton gets into kind of a disagreement with James Nicholson. This is Commodore James Nicholson, who was a very prominent member of the New York Democratic Republican Society. They get into kind of a bout over politics, and there's a challenge to a duel. Alexander Hamilton actually got into a challenge to a second duel in that same day. There was just a lot going on that day. It was very busy for him. But from Alexander Hamilton to James Nicholson, the 20th of July, 1795. And this is just great. I think you should totally look these up and just read through kind of what these look like. Sir, the unprovoked rudeness and insult which I experienced from you on Saturday leaves me no option but that of a meeting with you, by which they mean a duel, the object of which you will readily understand. I propose to you for the purpose Paulus Hook as the place, and Monday, next 11 o'clock as the time. I should not fix so remote a day, but that I am charged with trusts for other persons, which will previously require attention on my part. My friend Colonel Fish, who is to deliver you this, will accompany me. I am your humble servant. James Nicholson, I had the honor of receiving a note from you a few minutes ago by Colonel Fish relative to an altercation that took place between us on Saturday last. On an occasion of this kind, I shall certainly not decline your invitation. Its peremptory tenor necessarily precludes any discussion on my part of the merits of the controversy. The publicity of the affair and the unusual visit of your friend have, however, unfortunately occasioned an alarm in my family and may produce an inquiry. You will therefore perceive that any situation will be rendered extremely disagreeable unless our interview takes place before that time. I have therefore to entreat that it may not be postponed longer than tomorrow. I am, etc. yours. Somehow during kind of the duel proceedings, these are the seconds that are communicating with each other. And again, if you've seen Hamilton, you know kind of the rules of dueling and how that goes. Udney Hay steps in for James Nicholson. So he was clearly in New York City at this time and close enough in this circle that he could just step in and serve as a second in a duel. So this is just his letter to Nicholas Fish. Mr. Udney Hay presents his respectful compliments to Colonel Fish and requests an interview with him as soon as possible. Mr. Clinton, DeWitt Clinton, being absent. So that's the nephew of George Clinton, powerful kind of Democratic Republican family in New York. So kind of just, that gives a sense of sort of his place in these social circles, still very prominent in New York City at this time, and kind of in that sort of political community, that he was a very well-known guy. So the next year, he moves to Underhill, 1796. And this is the Devlin property where he moved to, and that's the property deed there that's noting the purchase of the property happening at that time. So 1796, just to get a sense, the population in 1791 had been 59. This is a very small town. It still is. By 1800, it was 212. Very small town, very small population. And Poker Hill was the population center at that time and up until about 1825. But you just think about like the number of families there. 1791, there might have been maybe a dozen families or so. By 1800, 20, 30 families, something like that. Very small town, small community. And this is where Udney Hay chooses to live. So immediately he starts to get involved in local politics. He's a town moderator, 1796. Sorry, I forgot to change the slide there. Town moderator, 1796, 1798 to 1800. Town selectman, 1797 and 1799 to 1800. And in the state legislature from 1798 to 1804. And these are a couple photos provided by Roger. The first is the foundation of the #1 schoolhouse, 1786. And the second there is the North Underhill Cemetery, which kind of represents sort of where the center of town was at that point in time, Poker Hill being the population center at that time. And likely there was a church there next to the cemetery originally, and that likely was kind of like the center of town, serving as the meeting house for Underhill. 1798, the XYZ affair and quasi-war. So at this point, there's growing tensions with revolutionary France. There's kind of been off and on tensions throughout this time. But the big thing that happens here is France refused to receive U.S. diplomats unless several conditions were met, right? So the United States sends diplomats to France to kind of try to ease their tensions the same way that they had done with the British. But when their diplomats get to France, the French demand a large loan of some millions of dollars, 10, 12 million, something like that, a formal apology from John Adams, who was a Federalist opposed to the French, and on top of that, $250,000 to the French foreign minister personally, just as a personal bribe. This was published in newspapers and was so outrageous that even Democratic Republicans, very in favor of France, typically, were outraged by it. Universal American outrage. Everybody recognizes this as a very unfortunate thing that France did to the United States. So Udney Hay actually, by order of the town meeting, Udney Hay chairman, he leads the town in crafting kind of what I've called the Underhill Resolutions. This is a very lengthy document. The whole thing is actually on the Historical Society website. There's a piece about it. It has the entire thing. So yeah, it'll give you an additional proof of your impartiality and oblige Udney Hay, that's what the UH is, a number of the inhabitants of Underhill in the state of Vermont, having met together for the purpose of reading with attention and comparing their various sentiments on the late dispatches from our commissioners to the Republic of France. Finding on examination that there was not in the whole town more than one man who was not a firm, tried Democratic Republican, and perceiving at the same time that there was a perfect unison of opinion, requested the selectmen to draw up such general resolutions, maxims, or opinions as they should deem most expressive of the universal sentiment of the whole town. So this was a lengthy document that was like grievances against France. And what's interesting about this document is it's addressed directly to France. Clearly, the idea was for this to go viral, right, as we would say today, that they were to publish it in many newspapers and hopefully have it actually reach France directly to address what had happened. And this is interesting to me because this is kind of aligned with sort of what was going on with Citizen Genet. It's kind of just individuals, or in this case kind of at the town level, sort of taking that agency to sort of act on kind of foreign affairs, which is, it was kind of like testing the waters of kind of what was acceptable in the early republic. It's still not really clear which way the government is going to function going forward. Precedents were being set by the federal government, but it was still unclear kind of where the boundaries were between the powers of states, towns, and the federal government. And I think that this is a very interesting case of kind of a town level thing like this happening. So there's that last one, that was published in the Green Mountain Patriot. May 25th, 1798. They published the entire thing. It's very long. It takes up, like, these are big newspapers. It takes up a lot of the newspaper. Goes through the entire thing. This is the Vermont Gazette, Bennington. simply says, we received a very lengthy communication from Underhill by the last post, the purport of which seems to be that the Democrats in that town, having had a meeting, expressed their resentment of the treatment of our envoys have received from the French government. They're saying, we received this is what it was about. However, it is impossible for us to oblige our Underhill friends with a publication of their address unless they will defray the expense of a supplement. They're saying, we're not going to publish this unless you pay us to do it. So a bold kind of attempt there to get in all the newspapers didn't work out on this one. But it kind of shows sort of what was going on and the attempt to kind of disperse this very widely. Is kind of, and just thinking about that is, Udney Hay, somebody who's clearly interested in politics and kind of wanting to sort of expand influence, that this was kind of an interesting way of going about it with that event that happened. This is excellent. These are reactions. People saw these resolutions in the newspaper, and there was a debate about it, right? In the newspaper, there was a debate about this. You know, you think of like social media today, this is what it was at the time. And this is just delicious. This was in verse. There was, across multiple papers, there was a rap battle in verse going back and forth on this issue. So this is in response to Equation, who was in favor kind of the Underhill resolutions, the Democratic-Republican view. This is the response from Juvenis, who was speaking for the Federalist perspective. Believe me, sir, it is a fact, however vile may be the act, not one of all your Gallic tribe did ever refuse a generous bribe. They're referring directly to that bribe. They sell their souls without remorse as jockeys do a crippled horse. The man who gives the greatest price is sure to gain them in a trice. And now, good sir, your flagellation, having received its termination, to Underhill will I be jogging and give those Jacobins a flogging. He's saying that these are the radical Democratic Republicans in Underhill. The newspaper just said we're all Democratic Republicans, and he's saying, I'm going to come and whip you for that. They're so opposed to that kind of sentiment that he's just saying, kind of, again, speaking for the Federalists about that. Our demos in the West of late are much perplexed about affairs of state. They meet, debate, and even pretend the British treaty is not our friend. They're referring to the Jay Treaty there. Say they, it is a cursed thing. 'Twill curb, we fear, our eagle's wing. 'Tis strange indeed, we can't divine it, why Jay and Washington should sign it. They're saying, you think that George Washington, the father, would sign this if it was a bad deal. They might have known our dear ally would make us ingrates sing Percavi. I believe that I think it's like a French, it might be a French reference there. The Percavi. Thus say the folks of Underhill, who have in politics much skill, they hold town meetings and debate on weightiest business of the state, kind of mocking the meeting that they had there. Compare our treaties with each other, and make a devilish rout and pother. When lo, 'tis said, not 1 in 10 of those most wise, sagacious men, who thus decide, with curses hearty, ever read the French or British treaty, and never will, I can foresee, unless they learn their ABC. But Udney Hay, a second lot, preserves the place from going to pot. For should we search the town all round, 10 men of sense could not be found. These are the men who have resolved our treaty ought to be dissolved. Poor souls, I know, poor souls, they knew not what they did. I blame them not, no, heaven forbid. And now, before my leave I take, this supplication I will make, that all our railing demigods may migrate to the land of frogs. He notes that that's France. He's saying you can all go to France if you love it so much there. And this is just wonderful. Underhill replies, this is June 1798. The people of Underhill have read Juvenis's feeble attempt to satirize their late resolutions and request him to be assured that they not only most sincerely wish for an amendment of his head and heart, but that pretending to no uncommon degree of political knowledge, common sense convinces them that they ought not to be offended at this impertinence, because it clearly appears to have been the offspring of an unbounded vanity, which nature having made his predominant passion, time and experience alone can cure. This is the social media of the time. This is going on in the newspapers back and forth throughout the time period. There's so much of this in there, and this one just happens to pertain specifically to Underhill. Election of 1802. So Martin Chittenden was the most prominent Federalist running in 1802. Udney Hay is running as the Democratic Republican in 1802. And just to give a sense, this is Martin Chittenden's house. This was actually just sold in Jericho. Beautiful house. But it gives you a sense of kind of the Federalists, how they might have been perceived. It's a very nice house. Not maybe how Democratic Republicans might have seen the common man. It looks more like the aristocracy of somebody like Alexander Hamilton. This is just to give a sense. This is a newspaper during the election season. And you can see I highlighted Hay here. These newspapers are 4 pages. The entire front page is all about Udney Hay. And in many of these newspapers, there's like half a page, a whole page, 2 pages dedicated just to talking about Udney Hay. This is like a year of this going on in the newspapers, back and forth every week. Multiple newspapers he's referenced, very prominent in the state. He's like a very, very prominent political figure. Everybody knows about him, what he thinks, and has opinions about him. This is just a piece from kind of during that election season, 1802, just to give a sense of kind of what was going on more broadly in the country. So this is Gideon Granger, U.S. Postmaster. He mentions this is a letter to Thomas Jefferson, September 1802. In New York, I have breakfasted with Colonel Burr. His opinion that the Republicans of New Jersey will carry the elections. Not a word passed respecting what had happened in New York. I was prepared to converse, but not to open the conversation on that subject. Luckily, I met with DeWitt Clinton and had a lengthy conversation. He avers the substantial facts changed in the pamphlet can be proved. He says the state is perfectly safe. He thinks the city is so too. From him, I learned that Udney Hay, he's referring to Udney Hay, felt certain of success in the Vermont election. So broadly across the country, kind of high-up figures are aware of kind of what's going on in these state elections, and they're aware this is their man in Vermont, Udney Hay, for the Democratic Republicans. They're thinking he's going to win. This is just kind of a separate piece. This is a letter from This is to Thomas Jefferson from Albert Gallatin. This is 1802, kind of the same election season, but it just gives a sense of kind of like what Udney Hay was up to. I enclose a letter from Colonel Hay of Vermont, but have informed his friends here that the French would not admit any consul in their West Indian colonies. He's asking a favor. Udney Hay wrote to Albert Gallatin, and it's addressed from Underhill, the 17th of August, 1802. He was asking for his nephew, Alexander Hay, to be appointed as a consul at Martinique. But again, it's similar to kind of some of the Washington correspondence. It suggests that he viewed himself as kind of lofty enough a figure to be able to do this, that he could just kind of write to officials like this, ask Jefferson, ask Albert Gallatin to help out with this kind of thing. And it's noted here that this was endorsed by Thomas Jefferson, Hay Udney, to Mr. Gallatin, and it survives in his records. 1802 election conspiracy. So this is kind of more of what's going on in the newspapers. There was, and this is all in the February 17th, 1803. This is the election of 1802, and this kind of happens frequently. The election didn't get decided immediately. If you didn't have enough of a majority of the vote, then you would have to run another election until you kind of got the right numbers for the candidate to be kind of selected as the new person. But there were several kind of these elections that had to happen because of the results of these. And this is early 1803. So there was this suggestion that Amos Marsh, another Federalist running opposed to Martin Chittenden, actually had an agreement with Udney Hay to split the Federalist vote. They were saying, Colonel Hay, many of the citizens in the Northwestern District have suggested that there is an agreement between you and Amos Marsh relative to the election of a member of Congress. You will much oblige the impartial electors of said district to give information publicly whether Mr. Marsh ever directly or indirectly intimated an agreement of that kind. So just the same here with the other pieces. They're saying that there seems to be foul play here, that there's like kind of an agreement happening. And Udney Hay responds and says, that there's nothing of the kind happening. Reading today, a little bit unclear exactly what happened, but we'll look at the election results in a moment here. But there's kind of like a lot of slander in these newspapers. There's, similar to today, there's just so much kind of political mudslinging going on in the newspapers. And there's a suggestion here, again, unclear what really happened, that there may have been a duel. Conjecture whispers that Colonel Hay and the Democratic Federalists have had a meeting on York's side of Lake Champlain for the purpose of settling, yes, thank you, an affair of honor. The cause is supposed to be the misrepresentation of the character of the former by the latter in the Vermont Sentinel of the 27th of January. Now I'm thinking it may have actually been like a misunderstanding. There's so much of these kind of like pseudonymous kind of pieces in the paper. I think they mixed up the names here because the Democratic Federalists actually would write in favor of Udney Hay. There were other detractors, but I'm thinking that they may have mixed up the names there. The Democratic Federalist may have actually been Udney Hay himself. There was also the Moderate Federalist. There's several of these names. Some may have actually been close friends, as they claim to be. Some of them may have just been him writing himself. But there was a piece against Udney Hay in the paper that they're referring to here, but it was by a different author. Colonel Hay this day passed through town from the southward to his seat in Underhill with his sidearms, and he is seldom seen traveling in this manner. It may be conceived as a circumstance corroborating the above conjecture. Should this prove to be the case, we congratulate the colonel on his retaining, even at the wane of life, those nice principles of honor. He's saying, good for him, he's still dueling. Firmness and intrepidity, which have ever appeared so conspicuous in him, and which so highly conduced to the attainment of our national independence, while at the same time we regret, most bitterly regret, that the legislature of this state should have so very unwisely adopted an act which in the present case must militate so essentially against the election of Colonel Hay and General Morris. So that's Lewis Morris, a Federalist, and they're saying that this is kind of what the suggested duel was between Lewis Morris and Udney Hay, and they're saying that if there really was a duel that took place for the offenses in the newspaper, that should disqualify both of them from running. There's this other piece over here that says, Mr. Editor, finding the story about Colonel Hay's affair of honor on the York side of Lake Champlain has been strongly suspected by some persons to have been founded on truth and having undoubted assurance that it was only handed to you as a piece of fun arising from the colonel having been seen with a sword lately presented to him as the gift of a dying friend. I request you to publish this, that no part of the free men may any longer be deceived on this head. Now this is interesting to me because we know that Udney Hay did participate in duels, at least as a second. He was part of kind of this culture of honor. It would be expected that he might do something like this. Unclear what actually happened, but an interesting claim there. This is kind of just something else that I found interesting. I had wondered specifically, this kind of goes back to my original questions, what did people think about Alexander Hamilton or whatever was going on in politics? We've seen now that Udney Hay knew Alexander Hamilton, maybe not closely, but that they were acquaintances, very familiar with each other. This is written by the Democratic Federalist, who I suspect, and people in the newspapers at the time suspected, to be Udney Hay himself. But just kind of an interesting note here, both on the criticism to himself and some of his views. He's mentioning that one of the main criticisms against him is that he's a foreigner. As far as this respects his not being an American, it is literally true, for he was born in Great Britain, Scotland. But they're saying here, would this not be an insult to the ashes of our beloved Washington? He's saying, George Washington respected foreigners. Why can't others? And the liberal mind must disdain this ungenerous discrimination where the services of the person commenced at so early a period, and be assured that Mr. Hay has no objection to the whole of his conduct during the Revolution being minutely detailed and most strictly inquired into. This comes up a lot, his Revolution record, his relationship with Washington, his relationship with kind of other prominent figures, and in some of these papers, he kind of describes that, he defends himself, he explains his side of the story. Down here, this is from a different paper, the same author, Democratic Federalist, potentially Udney Hay himself. But let me examine further. Is it against Mr. Hay as a foreigner or as a Republican that your rancor is leveled? And he mentions Alexander Hamilton is also a foreigner. Federalists love the guy. I must here indulge myself with observing that I believe Mr. Hamilton to be a man of the strictest honor. He has been no mongrel politician. His political principles since the termination of the war have been constant and uniform. I'm thinking that might have been Udney Hay's sentiment about Alexander Hamilton. But he's saying, we're both foreigners. We can be involved in politics. There's nothing about that should disqualify us or make us less American. We've participated in the war. We've kind of participated in the building of the nation. There should be nothing wrong with us having a say in politics. This was from May 5th. This was just before the last results of the election. This is one of his defenses, kind of responding to the criticisms. So these are, I kind of just cited these are some of the claims that were made against him. Somebody's saying Mr. Hay has declared before respectable gentlemen in this country that he was of opinion that Thomas Paine would be a real service to our country. Thomas Paine, by this point in time, was very disliked because of his support for the French Revolution. He was viewed as a strong radical, a dangerous person. Democratic Republicans were warmer kind of toward him, but even some of them kind of took certain issues with being an atheist or some of his kind of political claims or support of certain things. But here he's saying, people claim that because I've spoken in favor of Thomas Paine, that should disqualify me. Correspondent further says, let Mr. Hay deny if he dare that not being indulged by Mr. Washington with a wish for promotion to office of profit and honor, he has ever since been his secret enemy. That he was an enemy to his administration, and that he remains the enemy even of his ashes. The response to this is pretty interesting. He says, he references when his house was burned. He said George Washington reached out and offered help to me for that. And he mentions that there was kind of a funeral procession, kind of a memorial in, I believe Burlington is where he's referring to, and he said that he was appointed kind of to lead that ceremony himself, kind of being identified as sort of the prominent figure in the area with a connection to Washington. Just an interesting remark here. Kind of in his closing to kind of this criticism. Will common sense admit of a belief that any person who is removed but 1 or 2 degrees from idiotism would place himself deliberately in such a despicable situation? But I say no more. I hope a generous public will have the goodness to forgive my saying so much as I already have, on considering that it became absolutely necessary for the preservation of my reputation as an honest man. So he's writing kind of in defense of his honor there. He's signing with his own name there. That's Burlington, May 1803. But just so these excerpts kind of just get a sense, you get a little bit of a sense of kind of like what he was like in person a little bit. So this is the election results, Vermont number 4 Northwest District. So there were 4 districts at the time. He was running in the District 4 Northwest District. So these are the different ballots here. And you can see where the suspicion might have come from. This is interesting. Both the first ballot, December 13th, 1802, you can see why he was so confident that he was going to win. He has 45% of the vote himself. The Federalist vote is split. Martin Chittenden, Amos Marsh, Daniel Chipman, I believe he was the brother of Nathaniel, who we saw earlier. All these other Federalists, you can see kind of the strength of the Federalists here. There's a lot of Federalist candidates. Udney Hay is the Democratic Republican. Second ballot does even better. He has 49%. Vote still split. Martin Chittenden, Amos Marsh. That was around the time of the claims that there may have been kind of an agreement between them. Third ballot, Amos Marsh drops out. Martin Chittenden wins. 54% of the vote. So this was kind of obviously very disappointing to Udney Hay, but this was kind of like I would say sort of like the culmination of his political career. This kind of election, everything written in the newspapers. He goes into a lot of detail about his beliefs. There's kind of like a lot of back and forth about the politics going on in the state at the time. Reading through these, it gives you a very good sense of kind of what the thinking was at the time in the state. And it tells a lot about kind of his role as a political figure and how broadly known he was in the state at the time. In 1806, a few years later, Hay was elected to the Vermont Council of Censors. And the Council of Censors was sort of tasked with overseeing the state constitution. It was kind of the way that it was set up kind of as a republic in 1777. There was kind of this council that was appointed for managing the Constitution, periodically proposing amendments and making sure that the Constitution was enforced in the state. It was like a very highly regarded body, and he was on that in 1806. And that same year, he dies. He died September 6, 1806 in Burlington. Probate records indicate that he was in debt, likely buried in Burlington. So there's a grave marker in the Underhill Cemetery. In the newspapers, I think it was in the 1960s, there was kind of like a commemoration for Udney Hay, and there was, I believe that's when this stone was placed there. And I think it was kind of just assumed that he must have been buried in the cemetery there. This is kind of why I personally was sort of against the idea of kind of placing a sign in that cemetery, because I think that he's not really buried there. I think that would be misleading. I think he's in Burlington. I haven't identified exactly where that would be if he is, but his obituary suggests that likely it was Burlington. And I think that his house kind of is a better representation of kind of his place in the town because of that. So these are just, there's a very long obituary. September 10th, 1806. This is also on the Historical Society website under kind of his Udney Hay's estate, if you're interested in reading the whole thing. But it just has some interesting bits here kind of about his personality. His wit was facetious, seldom severe, and rather recorded a smile than imparted a sting. His judgment was penetrating, solid, and firm. His apprehension quick and clear. His imagination usually vigorous and sprightly, but always obedient to reason. To these were united a generous warmth of friendship and gratitude, which stood fixed at a perpetual summer solstice, and benevolence so active, so expansive, that it beguiled, as it were, every other quality of his heart. It mentions here a little bit about his early life. In early life, Colonel Hay came to America without education, without property or friends. During the Revolutionary War, he soon and long distinguished himself in the department where he was stationed as an active, enterprising, and able officer. And since the establishment of our state, his influence in our public councils for a considerable number of years has been predominant beyond a parallel. As a politician, his views of public affairs were marked with an amplitude of thought that spoke man of prospect and profound sagacity. Very lofty rhetoric. With a sovereignty of mind that soared above the petty motives which tempt little souls from a straight course, he early adopted a system and adhered to it with unwearied pertinacity to the end. If at any time he had the zeal of a partisan, it was without asperity. And his political adversaries, however they may deprecate his influence, must bear testimony to his sincerity of opinion and his suavity, the suavity of his manner in debate. Never vehement or overbearing, perceptive of reason, and open to conviction. To crown the whole, Colonel Hay was a philosopher. So that gives you a sense of kind of, maybe not his detractors necessarily, but generally, you do get the sense that he was highly respected, even by political opponents. And it's unclear who's writing this in the newspaper, but there are many pieces in the newspaper that say, I disagree with Udney Hay on everything political, but he is a good man, and he should be respected as such. So I think that this does represent sincere community sentiment about him. There was the last question that I had about fancy pants and what people wore at the time. And this is fascinating. His estate, his probate records, it shows everything that he owned at the time of his death. And lo and behold, one pair, lion skin pantaloons. Absolutely fabulous. Could not have asked for fancier pants than that. There's several things on here that are lion skin. there's some not necessarily high class things, but it gives you a sense of exactly how he dressed. And I kind of just went through some images. This is George Beau Brummel, 1805. It's just before the year that he died. So basically everything that this guy is wearing is listed here. The boots, the pantaloons, the coat. That's likely about how he would have appeared in life at the time. That's the sort of fashion of the times, and based on his records here, that's the kind of clothing that he owned. And one bit here, very interesting, one small book, Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. Indeed, he is a Thomas Paine lover. But that kind of summarizes sort of just kind of, it gives a sense more generally also just of kind of like what did Underhill look like at the times. Very interesting piece there. And lastly here, this is the roadside marker. So this is kind of the culmination of a multi-year project here to get a roadside marker for Udney Hay. So kind of, it's important to note that it's not easy to get these markers. So Roger gave me kind of some stats here. There's 315 markers in the States, in Vermont for 152 towns. Most towns only have like one or two. Burlington, they have like 25 or something. But many towns, they might just have one. Many towns don't have any. It's not easy to get this. You have to submit a large application package. It takes months of review. There's a very strict word count limit. The state reviews it. There's only about 12 to 15 granted in a year. And the state reviewed this one, and they said, we think you should have two sides to this sign, and you do deserve it. So kind of just a very, I think is a very happy conclusion to this project. And it kind of speaks to his significance in the state, and that's recognized at the state level, that he was a very prominent figure, and not enough is known about him. So I mean, this basically summarizes what we've already discussed here. Scottish-born Udney Hay was a timber merchant in Quebec who joined the 2nd Canadian Regiment of Colonel Moses Hazen, January 1776, to support the American colonies in the fight for independence. He was appointed Assistant Deputy Quartermaster General for the Northern Department in July 1776 and breveted a Lieutenant Colonel in January 1777 at the recommendation of General Horatio Gates. Hay served under General Arthur St. Clair in 1777 when Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence fell to the British. In 1780, New York Governor George Clinton chose Hay as the state agent for the Continental Army. General George Washington wrote Benedict Arnold, 1780, that Udney Hay was a faithful and indefatigable officer. After the Revolutionary War, Udney Hay became involved in politics. He authored the Constitution for the Democratic Society of the County of Chittenden in 1794 and was a member of the New York Democratic Society. In 1795, Hay replaced DeWitt Clinton as a second for James Nicholson in a duel proposed by Alexander Hamilton. The dispute was resolved through negotiation between Hamilton's and Nicholson's seconds. Hay moved to Underhill in 1796. He was elected as selectman and served as a state legislator from 1798 to 1804. He ran unsuccessfully for Congress in 1802. He was on the 5th Council of Censors, charged with determining if the government had conformed to constitutional limits. Hay died in Burlington in 1806. So overall, this has been a very enjoyable project to work on. It's kind of opened my eyes to kind of like what early Underhill was like. I learned a lot about early America in the process because he was involved in so much stuff going on at the time. He was a very important figure in the Revolution. He was recognized as such at the time. Very prominent early political figure at the local and at the national level. He was known, helped to shape kind of that Democratic Republican Party early on. And his story just collectively tells us about Underhill in general. I often also wonder kind of, the Revolutionary War, what were people fighting for, kind of what was the hope afterward? And I think it's interesting that we have Udney Hay here, a very high-ranking officer, and that Underhill is kind of representative of what he hoped for, a place where he could settle down, get involved in kind of politics, kind of the rough and tumble of early America. I think that just tells us a lot about the times and a lot about our town here. So yeah, that's everything. Yeah. Yeah, questions. Yeah.
Wife, children, descendants in Underhill?
Right. So he was married. He did have children. Yeah, I don't know too much about his family. He appears to have been divorced around 1792, it appears. Yeah, I haven't found a whole lot on that. But yeah, that's another good point here is, in terms of this story, this is kind of just scratching the surface of kind of like what's accessible information online. I've seen archives referencing other things I didn't have the opportunity to look at, but there's definitely a lot more that could be investigated here. And yeah, some of the family and descendants and everything.
So his daughter's buried.
Yeah, so yeah, Roger's mentioning his daughter is buried in the Underhill cemetery. And it's also noted that I think he had some descendants in New York as well, then later on, like Ohio. There's a couple mentioned on the Wikipedia page. I think there's some other, like, Grave Finder and some other sites that mention some other connections there. Yes?
And the list of his belongings when he died, where you noted the panelers and so forth.
Yes.
Did it also mention his property? His home?
Yes.
Oh, I did.
Yeah, that was just a small selection. The whole thing is on the website. Yeah, the whole thing his estate is on the Historical Society website. And I honestly haven't digested all the details, and there's a lot there. But yes, it does go into that.
I'd be curious how much the land was worth.
Yeah. So it lists off all those details, debts owed, which also even gives you a sense of like kind of like what he was kind of doing around the time. Yeah, there's a lot in there. Yes.
When you mentioned the seconds for the duels, were the seconds intended to actually shoot in some, or just to negotiate for the primary?
Right, they were the negotiators, exactly. So, they might get your pistols ready. If you're using like dueling pistols, they'll help kind of facilitate sort of the time and the place, the meeting, get all the details sorted out. They might help you if you get shot. But yes, the primary purpose is resolving without doing the duel. And it's kind of seen as like a failure of the negotiators if you actually result in the duel. Typically, they're resolved without getting to that point, which is what happened here. But yes, that is the role of the second. Yes?
Was there anything particular that precipitated his ending up in Underhill as opposed to just somewhere else around the Vermont?
Right. So I think it may have had to do with like his association with the Allens and that he was like doing land transactions. I think it's likely that he may have just ended up with like a large parcel in Underhill and just kind of decided to use that. He seemed to be having some money issues. He appears to have lost the Clinton house there in New York for debt, and he may have been limited in options potentially by that point in time, and he may have kind of had to kind of take what he could get, and that may have just come up in some of his land dealings. But I do think that there was some intention in specifically moving to Vermont, kind of for the kind of political reasons, most likely. Yes.
He's a known quantity, and he appeared in the Vermont Encyclopedia.
Yes. Yes. Not known enough, I think, though. But yes, you're right. He is out there in certain places. The more I've looked into this kind of thing, the more I realize that a lot of our understanding of history is sort of the marketing of it, right? They say that Paul Revere, why wasn't like Samuel Prescott or whoever the others remember is because Paul Revere had the best publicist, right? So it's that you kind of know the figures who have the kind of the best writers for them. And I think that Udney Hay has a very good story. He just kind of doesn't have the writer yet.
He had it.
Right? Maybe. Yes.
Was there never a portrait painted of him like there were Washington and other famous people at that time?
No, I haven't seen.
Any portraits of him.
Yeah, I haven't seen any portraits of him. Yeah, so it's not known, but
That's lost, yeah.
yeah.
Does he still have a house that's at 375 Poker Hill Road, or is that gone now?
357. Yeah. So not the original house is gone. yeah, so it's just the property there. But I mean, it's interesting to think, that's, the road and, the scenery, that's what he would have looked at, right? So like he was just like talking to Alexander Hamilton like last week, and now he's walking down like Poker. It's just interesting to think about from that perspective. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for coming out. Appreciate it.